Please have a seat. And as we get our technology set up here, I just want to first extend a welcome to those of you who are here today, those who are visiting, those who are here for the first time. We're glad that you are here. If you're here today, you will notice that we are now encountering one of the most familiar passages and stories in all of Scripture. So my hope for us today is not necessarily for me to preach, but for us to preach. For the role of the preacher is to look at Scripture, unpack Scripture, and understand how we can apply Scripture in our lives today, looking through the lenses of art. And today we have a couple of ways that I'm inviting us to engage with this Scripture. The first is, how do we hear it? We did a little creative thing with the reading. We broke it up into parts so that we could hear the parts differently, hear the words differently. So that's one creative thing that a person can do when approaching Scripture. The other thing we have is art. Ellis, can we take the lights down to number 3, please? This is Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son. It is going to be another lens that we use to look at Scripture. And then we're going to employ our own sense of reason, and I'm going to invite you at some point soon to engage in conversation with those around you. All right? So first, let's learn a little bit about the context of this passage. This is one of 3 parables that deal with lost items. There's a parable of the lost coin, and there is a parable of the lost sheep, and then here we have the parable of the prodigal son, the return of the prodigal son. That's the traditional way that this is framed if you see the sections in Bibles. But the first thing I want to do is to invite you to insert yourself into these characters. Yes, these are all depicted as male characters, both in Rembrandt and in Scripture. But that doesn't mean that if you're not male, you cannot put yourself into this story. One of my professors likes to call this passage the return or the parable of the ticked-off older sister. So you get to be here. You get to be here. And I invite you to do whatever you need to do to find yourself in the story. So first, let's move through the passage a little bit and find out what's going on. The first thing you need to know is that Jesus has been roaming around. He has been eating with tax collectors and with sinners. And the scribes and the Pharisees are not so eager to celebrate as Jesus is. So he tells these parables to talk about what God's mercy looks like, what God's spirit of welcome looks like. And it is a rather extreme portrait of, in my opinion, the type of mercy that God calls us to emulate. One of the first things that I'd like to point out is that it says that the son goes and asks the father for his inheritance, basically. That was a wildly improper thing to do, right? Any son, any child who goes and asks for the inheritance before the parent is dead is basically saying, hey, mom, hey, dad, drop dead. It would have not been done. So that the son has the audacity to go and ask for this is one of the first things to notice. And then the parent gives it away. The parent chooses to do it. In our Bible study, some of the folks said, why would the father have done this? I don't know. Maybe you have been a parent faced with a child who has an extraordinary ask, and you don't know why you do it, but you do. Maybe you have been a child who had an extraordinary ask, and you just knew that you needed to offer that ask. Something to think about. And the father decides, it says in here, to give away his property or half of the property. The Greek would say that this word is bios, B-I-O-S, which is life. So the Father is not only giving away his stuff, the Father is giving away a part of his life, giving away a part of who he is to his child. All right, and then it says that the son goes away and kind of squanders. It doesn't really say he squanders it. It doesn't even say that he uses it for prostitutes, which the elder brother claims at the end of the story, right? Elder brother is making some stuff up, perhaps. But anyway, he doesn't have a plan. He scatters, the Greek might suggest. He scatters it. All right. So then we move into the idea that the son kind of comes to himself. He goes away, there's a famine, he can't, it's not working out the way he planned, right? So he returns to the father, and then he develops a plan. He says, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go back, and I'm going to ask my father to work as a hired hand. And notice here it's important that the son does not go back to be accepted as the son. The son's plan is to go back and just be, do his due diligence and work on the farm. But what does this parent do? Accepts him as a child. Accepts his return, which to me is such an indication of how God treats us when you and I are prone to wander, as the old hymn says, and drift away. Ours is a God who celebrates a return. But let's not forget the elder sibling. Let's go ahead and do it. How many of you can relate to the elder sibling? You mean to tell me I have been here all of these years doing my thing, this kid of yours goes away, and I am the one that's not even told that there's going to be a party? He's out in the field. Notice he returns and he hears the music playing. The party's already started. And he wasn't invited, and nobody went to get him. I would be pretty ticked off also, right? But again, we're getting that picture of the parent who is already celebrating this return. And the father says, son, all I have is yours. Let's keep this in perspective, right? All right, so that's just a little bit of an unpacking of the parable itself. And remember, parables are intended to be extreme. They're intended to be hyperbolic to prove a point. And the question for all of us today is, what point is that? What point about God is this parable trying to tell us? All right, let's take a look at Rembrandt. Miriam just told me she's seen Rembrandt. She sat in front of it. She says it's about the size of one of those stained glass windows and sits about as high. There's a man named Henry Nouwen who wrote a book called The Return of the Prodigal Son, and he spent time in front of this painting. It's in Russia at the Hermitage Museum, kind of embodying each of these characters. And he writes essays about being and reflecting on each of the characters. So you can see we've got elder son on the right, we've got the parent here on the left, and we've got the son. A few other characters in the background. It's also on the bulletin if that's easier to see. But what I'd like for you to do now is just couple up with a person or two or three people and just talk about what you notice in this painting. You know, artists, unlike preachers who get to ramble on and on and on and on, artists get one chance to snatch one slice of the story and depict it. Artists have to make that decision. So anyway, I would invite you now to turn to a neighbor, a friend, make a new friend, and just talk about what you observe. What do you see here? Can y'all see it back there? Let's finish up our whatever thought you're in the middle of. And in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you. Thank you all. So cool. Rembrandt is known to be one of the great exegeters of Scripture. There's another print that he has that is of the Father running out, right? He's dropped his staff and he's running because Scripture says that he saw from a distance the Son coming home and he runs to greet him. In that day, it would have been totally improper for kids, for a parent to have run, right? So, okay. Just some things that I notice are I'm just totally taken away by the posture of this child. One shoe is off, one shoe is on. His head looks shaved. The father is there. The elder son looks what? Ticked, pious. Yeah. It reminds me, as I think about how do we inhabit these characters, how many times have we not celebrated the success of someone else? How many times have we not celebrated that someone else does well and succeeds and is getting ahead? I can fall into that trap. How many times have I wanted and needed a return? How many times have I screwed up and someone has accepted me regardless of what it is that I did? And how many times have I had to stretch myself to be like the parent who says, "You're welcome, no matter what"? I think about the church, and that's what we're about. We're about allowing people to struggle. We're about allowing people to change their minds. We are about welcoming, and we are about returning. And ultimately, this is about celebrating. Celebrating. The Father just wants to celebrate. And so I'm thankful to be a part of a church that has this sort of celebration every single Sunday. All of us are the celebrants at that table and at this party. So as one of my preacher friends says, let us give thanks to the God that is more interested in relationship and not rebuke, in community, not canceling out, in reconciliation, not rebuke. And let us celebrate that we have a God of love. And as the anthem the choir is going to sing later, which is a setting by David Hurd, an alive composer of color, love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. Love is always inviting us in. Love is always pulling us toward the table. So no matter what you call it or where your focus is today or who you inhabit, maybe one or two or all three at the same time, the story we hear today is always about God's willingness to embrace us and God's eagerness, runs, skips, leaps to accept our return and throw a big party. And that party happens today. So come on in, love says. You are welcome on your worst days and on your best. You are accepted and holy and a beautiful, beautiful child.